Let's get started. Story number 1.
I had always been the type to seek solitude in nature. The busier the world got, the more I craved moments of stillness, far from crowds, away from everything. So when my friend Sarah suggested a camping trip to a remote area deep in the forest, I didn't hesitate. The plan was simple: a weekend away from the world, just the two of us, a tent, and the woods. No cell service, no distractions. We found a spot on an old hiking trail that seemed to be barely used anymore. It wasn't on the usual list of camping sites and wasn't advertised anywhere. It was exactly what I wanted, remote and secluded. The drive was long, winding through dense forests that seemed to go on forever. As we drove deeper into the woods, the sunlight gradually faded and the trees grew thicker, their trunks dark and tall. The world felt quieter, more hushed. By the time we reached the site, it was late afternoon. The sun was low, casting an orange glow through the branches. We set up camp near a small stream. The water gurgled pleasantly, creating a soft, rhythmic sound. We spent the next few hours gathering firewood, chatting about old memories, and enjoying the isolation. I could feel the weight of the city lift off my shoulders as the night began to settle in. When the sun finally disappeared behind the horizon, Sarah and I sat around the fire, eating dinner and watching the flames dance. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the cool evening air. There was something comforting about it: the flickering orange light, the crackle of burning wood, the distant rustle of leaves in the trees. It was peaceful, almost perfect. But as the night wore on, the quiet became too quiet. The usual forest sounds, the chirps of crickets, the calls of owls seemed to fade. It wasn't complete silence, but there was an odd stillness. The kind of stillness that makes you uncomfortable, like the air is thick with something unsaid. The firelight seemed to flicker faster, as if it too was disturbed by something it couldn't quite understand. "Do you feel that?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking the silence. She looked around, her brow furrowed. "It's like the air's heavy or something." I nodded, a small chill creeping up my spine. It was hard to explain, but something was off. The forest, which had felt so inviting earlier, now felt oppressive, as though something was watching us. We both sat in silence, the only sound the occasional crack of the fire. Sarah shifted uneasily beside me. I could see the unease mirrored in her face. "I thought I saw something moving in the trees," she said softly, barely above a whisper. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to admit that I'd seen something too, a fleeting shadow at the edge of the camp. It wasn't an animal, not a deer or a bear. The shape had been too tall, too thin, but when I had looked again, it was gone. "I'm sure it was just a shadow," I said, trying to sound confident. "Probably just the wind." But as I said the words, I didn't believe them. The air was too still. The forest felt too alive in a way I couldn't understand. We stayed close to the fire for the rest of the evening, our conversation halting as we both glanced nervously at the trees. Eventually, the fire began to die down, and we reluctantly retreated to our tents. It was late now, and we were both exhausted, but neither of us could shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I zipped up the tent flap, I heard a sound, a soft scraping, like nails dragging across stone. I froze, listening. It came again, closer this time. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bird, but the sound seemed too deliberate, too purposeful. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the wind whispering through the trees. The air outside had grown colder, and I could feel the chill creeping into the fabric of the tent. I kept hearing that sound, the scraping, coming from somewhere just outside the tent. My heart began to race. I wanted to look outside, to check, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I stayed perfectly still, listening to the unsettling sounds of the night. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, but the dream I had was unlike any I'd ever had before. It was a blurry, fragmented thing, flickering images, faces that didn't belong. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable. They were angry. I woke with a start, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. It was pitch black outside. My watch said it was around 3 a.m. Sarah's tent was quiet. The forest around us was still, and for a moment I thought everything was fine. But then I heard it again, scraping, faint but unmistakable, as if something was moving through the underbrush. Slowly, carefully, something deliberate. I forced myself to sit up. I was going to check it out. I had to. But the moment I unzipped the tent, a sharp, hollow voice whispered from the darkness. It wasn't a human voice. It sounded like it came from deep within the woods, like it had been waiting there for years. Leave. The word was clear. Cold. It chilled me to the core. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. The voice had sounded ancient, as though it didn't belong to this time, to this world. I closed the tent flap quickly, heart pounding in my chest. I tried to calm myself, but the panic started to rise. What was that? What had spoken? I turned to Sarah, desperate to find comfort in the familiar. Sarah, I whispered. Did you hear that? There was no answer. I crawled to her tent, knocking softly, behend, but there was no movement. My heart hammered in my chest as I unzipped her tent, and when I peered inside, I found it empty. Sarah's sleeping bag was still there, untouched. I felt the blood drain from my face. I stumbled backward, my head spinning. Where was she? Had she gone outside? Had she heard it too? Panic flooded through me. I rushed outside, calling her name, my voice trembling. But there was no answer. The forest around me was silent, unnervingly silent. I looked toward the darkened trees, but they were still no sign of Sarah. I took a step forward, the faint scraping sound coming again, closer now. I froze, unable to move. The scraping continued, and it wasn't until I heard a low growl, deep, guttural, that I realized something wasn't right. It wasn't Sarah, and it wasn't an animal. It was something else. I ran. I didn't look back. The forest seemed to close in around me as I sprinted toward the clearing where we had set up camp, my heart pounding in my ears. I don't know how long I ran, minutes, maybe hours, until I finally stumbled out of the woods and back to the car. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I was far from that place. I didn't go back for Sarah. I couldn't. The memory of that voice, the scrape, and the growl haunted me. I don't know what happened to her, and I don't think I ever will. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be a weekend of peace and quiet, a chance to disconnect from the world. My friend Tim and I had been talking about going camping in the deep woods for months. He had the gear, and I had the time. We both needed a break, and nothing seemed better than a remote site, far from the noise of daily life. We found an old, forgotten trail near a national forest, an area that hadn't been actively used for camping in years. The reviews were sparse, but we didn't care. We were looking for solitude, and this spot promised that in spades. The drive was long, and the deeper we went into the forest, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The trees were dense, their branches twisted like gnarled hands, blocking out much of the sunlight. The road turned to gravel, and soon we found ourselves in an area so remote that there was no cell service, no other campers, no signs of human presence for miles. It felt like we were the only people in the world. We set up camp by a small, fast-moving creek, its waters clear and cold. The sound of the stream rushing over rocks was soothing, and for a moment everything felt perfect. We gathered firewood, joked around, and cooked a simple dinner as the sun sank low in the sky. The sky above was a deep purple, dotted with stars, the kind of night that made you feel insignificant, like a speck in a vast ancient universe. After dinner, we sat around the fire, the warmth and light casting long shadows across the clearing. The night was peaceful at first, but soon a strange feeling crept over me, like I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, but it wouldn't go away. Tim seemed unaffected, cracking open a beer and staring into the flames. I did my best to relax, but I couldn't shake the sense of unease growing in the pit of my stomach. "Hey, you good?" Tim asked, noticing my fidgeting. "Yeah, just a little tired, I guess." "Sure you are. You've been jumpy all day." "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Maybe the isolation's getting to me." Tim just laughed, but I couldn't let go of the feeling that something wasn't right. The forest around us was eerily still. No animals, no insects, nothing. It felt like the world had gone completely silent, as if everything in nature had paused just for us. "I'll be right back. I'm going to grab some more wood," Tim said after a while, that standing up from his seat by the fire. "Yeah, all right." He walked off into the trees, and I was left alone, the firelight flickering in the growing darkness. The feeling of being watched intensified. I kept glancing into the woods, half expecting to see something move in the shadows, but there was nothing. I tried to push it out of my mind. Then I heard it. A faint sound, like something moving through the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't see anything, but the noise was definitely there, too rhythmic to be an animal. It sounded deliberate, like someone or something was walking towards me. My breath caught in my throat. "Tim," I called out, trying to sound calm. No response. The noise stopped. I strained my ears, trying to pick up on any sound, but all I could hear was the creak and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stood up, feeling the cold air settle over my skin. I walked a few steps toward the trees, but the forest was as silent as ever. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe some small animal. I decided to check on Tim. I didn't like the feeling of being alone anymore. I walked toward the direction he had gone, calling his name again. I didn't know what it was. Maybe I was just imagining things. But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The shadows in the trees seemed to grow darker, thicker. The air felt colder, almost unnatural. I walked further into the woods, but there was no sign of Tim. The path was winding, with trees clustered so tightly together that it was hard to see far ahead. The only sound was my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. My mind was racing, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Tim was probably just gathering a bit more wood for the fire, right? Then I heard something. Barely audible, but unmistakable. It was a soft, low whisper, like a voice calling out from deep within the forest. I froze, my blood running cold. It wasn't Tim's voice. It wasn't a human voice at all. It was different. It had a haunting, guttural quality, like the sound of something ancient, something that shouldn't have been there. "Tim," I shouted, my voice cracking. The whisper stopped. I waited, listening for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the whisper of the wind through the trees. I walked faster now, fear beginning to grip me tightly. There was no answer. No sound except for the distant rush of the creek and my own panicked breathing. Suddenly, I heard a crack of branches behind me. I whipped around, heart racing, but saw nothing. My mind was starting to play tricks on me. I was sure I had heard something, someone, behind me. I called Tim's name again, but all I got was silence. I turned and hurried back to camp, not looking over my shoulder. The air felt thick and heavy now, like something was pressing in from all sides. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being hunted, like something was out there, following me, watching my every move. I broke through the tree line and saw the glow of the fire in the clearing ahead. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. Tim was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. His back was to me, and he didn't seem to notice me approaching. I was about to call out to him when I froze. The air around the campfire felt wrong. The shadows in the trees seemed deeper, darker, and the firelight didn't reach as far as it should have. The camp felt off. I called his name again, louder this time. He didn't respond. Something was wrong. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, and fear crept up my spine. I rushed forward, but when I got closer, I froze in my tracks. Tim wasn't there. The figure by the fire was him, but not him. His body was slumped over, his face obscured by his hands, like he was bowing in some strange, unnatural way. The figure didn't move when I called out to it. It was like it didn't hear me at all. A cold, sinking feeling settled over me. I knew, without a doubt, that whatever I was looking at wasn't Tim. The shadows around the fire seemed to pulse, as if the darkness itself was alive. I turned to run, but as I did, I heard the whisper again. This time, it was closer, right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, dark and still. I didn't stop running until I reached the road. The forest behind me seemed to pulse with something sinister, but I didn't look back. I didn't dare. My feet were numb with fear, my breath ragged. When I finally reached the car, I didn't hesitate. I got in, started the engine, and drove without looking back. I never went back to those woods, and I never saw Tim again. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
The cold air carried the scent of pine and damp earth as Jake, Rachel, and Eric trekked deeper into the forest. It was supposed to be an adventurous weekend. No phones, no distractions, just nature. The towering trees around them whispered with the wind, their shadows stretching unnaturally as the sun dipped behind the mountains. "This is perfect," Eric said, dropping his backpack beside a small clearing. "Secluded, quiet, just us and nature." Jake chuckled, tossing a bundle of firewood near the tent they had set up. "Until a bear decides to visit." Rachel smirked. "Bears I can handle. It's the ghosts I'm worried about." Eric raised an eyebrow. "Ghosts?" Rachel glanced around the forest, her expression turning serious. You guys don't know the story? Jake shook his head as he started the fire. Oh, great. Here we go. Rachel leaned in, her voice lowering. A long time ago, a group of settlers built a small village deep in this forest that after one winter a sickness spread and nearly everyone died. Some say their spirits still wander here, lost, looking for help. Eric scoffed. You had me for a second. But Rachel wasn't smiling. That's not the creepy part. The last few survivors left marks, symbols on the trees to ward off the spirits. Some people believe if you see one, you're not supposed to speak its name, or else it follows you. The fire crackled between them, casting flickering shadows on the trees. The wind howled, making the branches creak like unseen footsteps. Jake rolled his eyes. Nice try, Rachel. Still, as the night deepened, an eerie silence settled over the forest. The usual sounds of nocturnal creatures, crickets, distant owl calls were missing. A heavy stillness swallowed the air, making every movement feel exaggerated. Rachel shivered. Is it just me, or is it too quiet? Eric threw another log on the fire. It's just your mind messing with you. But then, in the darkness beyond the firelight, there was a sound, a single, distant whisper. Rachel sat up straight. Did you hear that? Jake froze, his breath catching. What was it? Eric stood up and scanned the forest. Probably just the wind. But then they saw it. Carved into the trunk of a massive tree not 10 feet away was a strange symbol, an eerie spiral with jagged edges, half covered in moss. Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. That's one of the markings. Jake swallowed hard. Okay, that's weird, but it's just an old carving. Eric sighed. Relax. It's not like we said its name. A branch snapped. They all turned toward the sound. There was nothing. Just the thick wall of trees, their dark outlines shifting with the wind. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods came another whisper. Closer this time. A breathy, unintelligible voice. Rachel's hands clenched into fists. We should go back to the car. Eric forced a laugh. Come on, it's probably just the trees creaking. But as he spoke, the whispering grew louder. Not a single voice, but several, overlapping, hushed, urgent. Jake grabbed a flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. Hello? The beam landed on something pale. A face, a woman's face, peering from behind a tree. Rachel gasped, clutching Jake's arm, but when he moved the light, the face was gone. Nope, Rachel whispered. We're leaving. Eric was pale now, no longer amused. Yeah, let's go. They hurriedly packed their gear, stuffing sleeping bags and supplies into their backpacks. The whispering never stopped. It was all around them now, circling, getting closer. Then the fire went out. Jake's heart pounded. Run! They bolted into the darkness, guided only by their flashlights. The trees blurred past them, the air thick with the scent of damp leaves and something else. Something rotten. A shadow moved in the corner of Rachel's vision. She turned her flashlight. There it was, a tall, gaunt figure standing between the trees. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, empty, hollow pits. Rachel screamed. Jake yanked her forward. Go! Keep running! The whispers turned into wails, agonized, desperate. The trees seemed to shift, the path twisting, unfamiliar, and then, ahead of them, the car. They scrambled inside, slamming the doors shut. Jake turned the key, the engine roared to life, and they sped down the dirt road. No one spoke. The forest thinned behind them, the whispering fading into the night. After several minutes, Eric exhaled a shaky breath. What the hell was that? No one had an answer. As they reached the highway, Rachel dared to glance back. In the rearview mirror, just beyond the tree line, a face, watching and smiling. Story the end.
Story number 4.
We set off on our camping trip in early autumn, the kind of trip that promised crisp air and a canopy of golden and crimson leaves. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Ethan, and our 3 college buddies, Jake, Emma, and Sarah. The forest we were heading to was known for its deep, unmarked trails and dense thicket, a place that felt far from the noise of civilization. No one had ever mentioned it was haunted. We arrived at the edge of the forest just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. A thick mist rolled in from the trees, but it was nothing that would stop our excitement. We unpacked our gear and set up camp, the crackling of the fire comforting in the growing dark. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the firelight cast long shadows on the trees. The first night passed without incident. We swapped stories and roasted marshmallows, a usual camping ritual. Sarah told us about an old local legend she had heard about, something about the forest being cursed. The tale was silly. It said that deep within the woods, there were spirits that wouldn't let go of the living, claiming anyone who dared to stay overnight. But the laughter in the group drowned out her words. The second day dawned clear and chilly, and we decided to explore the area. We veered off the main trail and wandered deeper into the woods. The further we went, the more the landscape shifted. The trees grew taller and denser, their branches intertwining to form an almost impenetrable canopy. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds, no animals, just the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. We came across an old cabin, hidden behind a thick wall of vines. Its windows were boarded up, the wooden door hanging on a single rusted hinge. It was an eerie sight, like something out of a forgotten nightmare. Emma wanted to go inside, but we all hesitated. Something about the place felt wrong. But after some coaxing, we decided to take a peek. The air inside was musty and stale, the dust thick on the floors. The cabin had long been abandoned. We explored it cautiously, our footsteps echoing in the emptiness. In one corner, there was a faded journal, its pages brittle with age. Ethan opened it, reading aloud the last entry. "The spirits won't stop watching. They know you're here. The forest won't let you leave." We laughed it off, thinking it was just some poor soul's wild imagination. But the words stuck with us, gnawing at the edges of our minds as we made our way back to camp. That night, the fire crackled louder than usual, and the wind howled through the trees, shaking the branches above. We huddled around the flames, telling more stories, but an uncomfortable tension lingered in the air. Sarah mentioned the spirits again, but this time her voice trembled. She swore she heard faint whispers carried by the wind. "Stop it, Sarah," Emma snapped. "You're just scaring yourself." But Sarah wasn't listening. She was staring into the trees, her eyes wide with fear. "I saw something. I swear to God. I saw something." We turned to follow her gaze, but the darkness beyond the firelight was impenetrable. There was nothing there, just the endless blackness of the forest. "Don't be ridiculous," Ethan said. "You're just spooked. It's the woods playing tricks on you." But as the night deepened, things started to feel off. The air grew colder, and the rustling of leaves began to sound unnatural, almost like footsteps. It wasn't the wind, I was sure of it. Something else was moving out there, something alive. I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. The fire flickered, casting shadows that seemed to dance and move on their own. The temperature dropped again, and I noticed Sarah had gone pale. Her eyes were fixed on something in the trees. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. "Sarah?" Emma asked, her voice now full of concern. "What is it?" Sarah's hand trembled as she pointed into the woods. "There's someone watching us." None of us could see anything, but that didn't stop the feeling of being observed. The shadows seemed to shift around the edges of the firelight, as if something was moving just out of reach. "I think we should head back to the car," Jake said, his voice tight. He wasn't joking. None of us were. The sense of dread had become too overwhelming. We gathered our things quickly, but as we stood to leave, a blood-curdling scream split the night air, coming from deep within the forest. It was a sound like no other, a mix of pain and fear, the kind that freezes your bones. We froze, too scared to move, too terrified to even breathe. "Did you hear that?" Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. We all nodded, fear plastered on our faces. "Let's go," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "Now!" We didn't even bother to put out the fire as we grabbed our packs and ran in the direction we thought led back to the camp entrance. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches swaying even though there was no wind. The whispers, faint at first, grew louder, as if they were following us. I heard footsteps behind us, slow, deliberate steps that matched our own pace. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. I could feel my legs burning with the effort to run, but I couldn't stop. The whispers grew louder, and now I could make out words, but they weren't in any language I recognized. "Turn back. Stay. Forever." I pushed myself harder, urging the others forward, but Sarah tripped and fell. We didn't stop to help her. I heard her scream, her voice now shrill and panicked. I turned, but Emma grabbed my arm, pulling me away. "We can't help her," Emma said, her voice breaking. "We need to get out of here." We ran until the trees began to thin out, until the edge of the forest finally appeared through the mist. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were still behind us, growing louder with every step. Finally, we burst through the tree line and into the open, the dark night sky above us. The whispers faded and the footsteps vanished. We didn't look back as we sprinted to the car, gasping for breath. None of us spoke for a long time, too shaken by what we had experienced. We piled into the car, slamming the doors shut, and drove off, leaving the forest behind us. When we finally reached the nearest town, we pulled over and sat in stunned silence. No one had said it aloud, but we all knew. Something in that forest had been alive, something that had been waiting. The spirits Sarah had spoken of, they were real, and they had tried to claim us. As I write this now, the memory still haunts me. The whispers still echo in my mind. The image of Sarah's terrified face is burned into my memory, and I wonder if the forest is still waiting for us, watching, waiting for us to return. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It started as a simple camping trip. We, a group of 5 friends, Tom, Jamie, Sarah, Lucas, and I, had decided to venture off the grid for a weekend in the deep forest. We all had a love for hiking and camping, but this time we wanted something more secluded, a place far from the usual crowded sites, a place untouched by other campers. Tom had discovered it in an old hiking guidebook, some hidden campground deep in the woods that only locals knew about. It seemed like the perfect escape. We arrived at the forest late in the afternoon, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dense trees. The deeper we went into the woods, the quieter it became. The sounds of the outside world faded, replaced by the gentle rustling of the leaves and the distant call of birds. After a while, even those sounds disappeared. The silence felt oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. The campsite was about a 2-mile hike from where we parked the car, nestled near a creek that twisted its way through the trees. We set up our tents, gathered wood for the fire, and cooked our dinner. Everything seemed perfect, until the night began to fall. As the sun sank behind the trees, the temperature dropped rapidly, and an unnatural chill filled the air. We gathered around the campfire trying to keep warm. There was no wind, no animals, just the crackling of the fire and our voices breaking the silence. But as the night grew darker, something about the place started to feel off. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us. It wasn't the usual feeling of being in the woods. It was something different, something deeper. My friends noticed it too. Jamie, who usually joked around, kept looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to be there. Sarah kept her voice low, as if the trees were listening. Lucas kept scanning the woods nervously, his eyes darting between the trees. I tried to dismiss it. After all, we were in the middle of nowhere, and it was probably just our imaginations running wild in the dark. But as the hours passed, that strange unease grew stronger. Around midnight, when the fire had burned low, Tom stood up and suggested we take a walk to the creek, just to stretch our legs. I didn't want to go. I wasn't sure why. There was nothing particularly threatening about the idea of a walk, but something in my gut told me to stay by the fire. Still, I didn't want to seem scared, so I joined the others. The firelight faded quickly behind us as we walked deeper into the woods, our flashlights cutting through the dark. As we approached the creek, we heard the sound of water rushing over rocks, a soothing, familiar noise. But something else was there, too, a faint, echoing sound in the distance. It was too far off to be any animal or bird, but it was there like a soft whisper carried by the wind. It made my skin crawl. "I hear it too," Lucas muttered, his voice low. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. We all stopped, listening. The whispering seemed to come from every direction, as if the trees themselves were speaking. The noise was indistinct, like murmurs in a language we didn't understand. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and I could see the same tension in my friends' faces. "Let's head back," I said, my voice shaky. "This isn't right." We turned and started walking back to the campsite, the whispering growing louder the further we moved. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a hum, low and constant, like something was following us, urging us forward. Suddenly, Jamie screamed. We turned, flashlights flickering as we saw her standing frozen in place, staring into the trees. "There's something there," she gasped, her voice tight with fear. We all froze, and I followed her gaze into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but shadows, but then, just beyond the trees, I saw it. A figure, a shape standing still, almost motionless. The figure was tall, its outline blurry and indistinct, like a shadow that didn't belong. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel it watching us. "Is that a person?" Tom whispered. We were too far to tell, but the shape was wrong, unnatural. It didn't look like any person I had ever seen. It was too tall, too distorted. The longer I stared at it, the more it seemed to fade, its form twisting into something that was impossible to describe. "Let's go now," Sarah shouted, grabbing Jamie's arm. We turned and ran, not looking back. My breath came in sharp gasps as we sprinted through the trees, the sound of our feet pounding the ground mingling with the growing whispering noise. It felt as though the forest was closing in on us, the trees shifting, the path narrowing. The murmuring was louder now, clearer, like voices all around us, beckoning us forward, urging us to come closer. I looked behind, expecting to see the figure still following us. But the woods were empty. No shape, no movement, just the dense, silent trees. Yet the air felt thick, as if it had weight. The whispers were all around us, in our ears now. But when we looked to see where they were coming from, there was nothing. We reached the campsite in a frenzy, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding. The fire was still burning, but it seemed smaller now, less comforting. We didn't dare venture far from the fire. None of us spoke for a while, the only sound the crackling of the wood. "What the hell was that?" Tom finally broke the silence, his voice low and strained. "I don't know," I said, my mind racing, "but I don't want to find out." We tried to shake it off, tried to convince ourselves it was just our imaginations. But as the night dragged on, it became clear that something wasn't right. The air had grown heavier, colder. The whispering, distant at first, now seemed to fill the space around us. And the longer we stayed, the more I felt like we weren't alone. Something ancient, was there, watching, waiting. We decided to pack up and leave, but as we gathered our things, something strange happened. The campsite, which had seemed open and clear when we first arrived, now felt smaller. The trees seemed to be closing in around us, the path back to the car no longer visible. We stumbled around, disoriented, unable to find our bearings. That's when we heard it again, the growl. It wasn't an animal, not a bear or a wolf. It was low, almost guttural, and it came from deep within the forest. It wasn't a sound we could ignore. I felt it in my bones, a vibration that rattled me to my core. "Run!" I screamed. We turned and bolted, the forest closing in around us, the growl echoing in our ears. The trees seemed to move, shifting, blocking our way. It felt as though we were trapped in some kind of maze. But we kept running, driven by fear. Finally, after what felt like hours, we burst into a small clearing and saw the headlights of the car in the distance. We ran toward it, not daring to look back. We piled into the car and drove away, the forest receding behind us, the whispers, the growl, the figure. It all stayed with us, lingering in the back of our minds. None of us spoke much on the way home. We didn't need to. We all knew something had been out there with us. We never returned to that place. Story, the end.